Teenage Culture in the 1950s by Savannah Al-Sharari. When the war started, many of the boomers were too young to take action and voice their opinions, but being surrounded by the first event would help influence many actions taken during the Vietnam War. The introduction to rock and roll. This was a significant event to many teenagers as it influenced their behavior style and mentality in society. Most famous groups representing this genre were the Beatles. The beginning of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, which began in the beginning of 1955, was the first major event that caused a vast majority of teens to be outraged by the world. Many of the baby boomers, led at the age of speaking their mind, led many to protest for peace, love, and unity. This was the first introduction to the symbol known as the peace sign, which resulted in the sign being created in 1958. Teenage fashion in the 1950s for women. Teenagers took fashion as a way to voice their opinion. Many teenagers impacted Canada economically due to the high rise in the selection of what they wore. Marketing would quickly be focused on advertising to teens in the 50s because of the quantity of the amount of the worn in the baby boom, as well as the money in their pockets ready to be spent carelessly. However, teens were expected to dress more maturely, but being at the stage in life where to rebel was common, most of them chose to adapt a new trend, the first being the poodle skirt. For a vast number of females in their teens, poodle skirts were created by Julie Lynn Wardley, which was the main fashion statement in the 1950s. The umbrella skirt put under the pettiskirt was highly admired because of its ability to enhance a woman's figure, which led to many wearing it. Teenage fashion in the 1950s for men. Casual and preppy wear. For many men in their teens wore casual clothes such as button-up shirts but not buttoning them up, and tucking them in, gave the appearance of being a bad boy, but a cool one as well. Many of these trends were delivered from the Beatles, which girls loved at the time. Rocker jackets were also a big thing at the time. Also, peppy clothes such as sweaters with the iconic scarf wrapped around the neck. Both men and women dressed accordingly to attract each other using trending clothes in order to capture the other's attention. Recreational activities for teens. School. In the 1950s, both men and women were able to attend school as these stereotypes of women being inferior to men were slowly diminishing. Although school was not recreational, it was still a privileged activity for many at the time. Next, we have sports. The importance of sports in the 1950s was clearly identified as schools began teams to compete with other schools. Many of the major sports introduced to students that had the spotlight were basketball, football, baseball, and tennis. With the wide range of students attending school, many teens were assimilated, meaning mentioned earlier that this was the most common thing to do as teenagers. Pairing up with the opposite sex was the ideal perception at the time. In the past, in the 50s, going steady was identified as taking marriage seriously and beginning a relationship with the goal of marriage. School dances. Dances were a major hit in the 1950s. Both men and women danced on the dance floor, usually at the school gyms for teen hangouts where they were allowed to dance. Most dance moves were created at the time, such as the cha-cha, the bossa nova, the stroll. From a parent's perspective, dancing looked down upon and seen as reckless. However, many teens still danced as still being at the stage of life where they were rebellious. Jobs. Because of the money being spent by teens, obtaining a job was a mandatory need to support their ideal lives in the 1950s. Working at public places like a diner or helping parents out with the car store would be a typical job for teens in the 1950s. Drive-in movies were a typical thing to do with your day in the 50s. Many places would be screening movies. In an empty parking lot, they would also be serving popcorn, Coca-Cola, and other foods. With the majority of the movies being black and white, teen couples found it romantic to sit in a car with their lover and watch the movie. Iconic role models in the 1950s. Marilyn Monroe was valued highly amongst many because she was the first woman to symbolize sex. Her efforts and her acting changed the perception in the way sexuality was preserved in the eyes of many. She became a role model for many women. Next, we have Audrey Hepburn. She was another actress. She became a role model for many girls, reminiscing that other women being popular wasn't common before in the 50s. So having someone from a disadvantaged group in the past allowed many to look up to her. Elvis Presley, the most famous man from the 50s, was Elvis Presley and his love for rock and roll. He was named the king of rock and roll because of his appealing music to all during the time period. Many were moved by the journey of producing music, and many would listen to him. Elvis swayed the world with his existence and the actions taken during the time he lived. Many were influenced by the way he dressed and danced. The Beatles. Although the Beatles came around near the end of the 50s, they influenced many based on the style of their clothes they wore and their behavior they had. Talking about sex. Many parents were against the idea of sex before marriage because it was a typical thing that happened at the time. Since dating became popular, parents would punish their kids for this behavior. Boys in their hair. Many schools have standards for students attending, and something like your hair touching your ears for boys was enough for punishment. Hot rods. Hot rods are a type of car that you drive really, really fast. These type of cars were identified as too dangerous. Many teenagers thought they were cool at the time, and that's why they drove them. Dancing. Alongside dating, parents would get angry by the dancing that was going on at the schools. Many dances have been canceled by parents because of the concern about the type of dancing going on with their lovers. In conclusion of this presentation, the teenagers in the 50s were open to a different atmosphere, and their role models and the way they dressed was not accepted by adults. It concluded that many teens would become outcast teens have played a major role in history to the shaping of the economy and the ability to choose what is liked and disliked. Thank you.